Hey, welcome to your weekly corner Späti. It is me, Ciarán, and I'm joined by Nic.
Hello.
And I'm also joined by another Nic, Nic Maclellan, a researcher and journalist covering Pacific Island regions and correspondent for Island Business Magazine. Thank you, Nic, for joining. It is very late over there, so thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for the invitation.
We've had Nic on to talk to us about New Caledonia, a topic that is long overdue on this podcast, to be honest, because it was finally making news this side of the world, middle of last year. But obviously tensions have been building for a while. But I would say, to give you some context, Nic, I would say most of our listeners are aware of New Caledonia. They're aware that technically on paper it is a part of France, and would generally have the sense of like, that's probably bad. Don't know much of the details, but I don't like the sounds of that. France is over here, probably shouldn't be over there. That would be kind of the gist of it. Can you give us like a rundown of New Caledonia, what the society is like there, how France even ended up on this side of the world in the possession of New Caledonia?
Well, the islands of the Pacific are amongst the last area in the world still colonized by blue water European powers. You know, New Caledonia was annexed by France in 1853. France has 3 colonial dependencies in the Pacific Islands: New Caledonia, French Polynesia, and Wallis and Futuna. The Americans also have territories in the region, like an American Samoa and Guam. Those were historic relics seized during colonial expansion in the 19th century. But unlike Britain, France is still hanging on as a colonial power, and there's a number of drivers for why France maintains its overseas empire, not just in the Pacific, but in every ocean of the world. When New Caledonia was annexed in 1853, it was first used as a prison, just like my own country, Australia. European powers wanted to export prisoners to the other side of the world, starting with convicts, but also then later political prisoners. In 1871, the Paris Commune famously was met by repression by the Versailles forces, but some of the surviving communards, rebels like Louise Michel and Henri Rochefort and others, were deported literally to the other side of the world and lived in New Caledonia as a prison. There were also Kabyle rebels from Algeria in North Africa, 1871 revolt once again, and they were sent halfway around the world, smashing the leadership of nationalist movements, of political movements at that time. Later, New Caledonia became a site for free settlement. In the late 19th century, there was a program of bringing not convicts but free settlers to take land from the indigenous Kanak people. That's a Melanesian people. New Caledonia, just off the coast of Queensland, is surrounded by other Melanesian nations like Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji. And that process of expropriation led to a series of revolts throughout the 19th and early 20th century. In 1878, Chief Atai led a revolt against the theft of land. It was a time of an El Nino drought, and, the clans were being pushed up into the hills as settlers took their farming land. Hundreds of people were killed. The French military launched enormous repression of the Kanaks, and Atai became a symbol of revolt and resistance. Same thing, 1917, middle of the First World War, Chief Noel led a revolt against French rule, while many Kanak and Tahitians were fighting in the trenches in France against German invasion. Of course, at that time, they didn't have the vote. It was only after the Second World War that indigenous Kanak were allowed to vote. And so that colonial history weighs on the present. Most people in France know none of this history, but it's deeply ingrained in the indigenous population. but they become a minority in their own land through these waves of settlement in the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, France imported indentured labourers from Java, from Vietnam or Indochina as it was, to work in the major industry, nickel. New Caledonia has more than 20% of the world's reserves of nickel, which is a vitally important strategic metal. And so over time, the Kanak became a minority, and they've fought that ever since.
I guess my question would be in regards to its kind of like modern setup, because as an Irish person myself, I'm kind of very aware of, and I think this is also happens a lot in like English speaking discussions of British imperialism is often centered, and then because French imperialism is mostly documented in French, it kind of gets ignored. Linguistic barrier is still being a thing. I'm kind of curious as to how, like, I know how British imperialists talk about their kind of far-flung territories. I know how they talk about things like Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands and these kind of places around the world. How does a French imperialist, how does someone who's like very pro, I'm not even sure the correct term would be, like, are they called unionists? How does a French person who loves the fact that New Caledonia is a part of France, how do they describe this relationship? What is the supposedly on paper good aspect of this relationship? How's New Caledonia thought of?
Unlike the British, the French have a tradition of universalism since de Gaulle, had a coup in 58, brought in the Fifth Republic. The British, I'm of Scottish, my family are of Scottish heritage, so we know too about the English. And the Brits have always had a tradition of second-class citizens. So if you do live in the Falklands or in Gibraltar or whatever, you don't have the full rights of someone who lives in London. That's different for the French. And part of this notion of French universalism, the United Republic. So if you're Tahitian or Kanak or Wallis and Futuna, if you live in Martinique or Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, you're French. You have the right to vote for the French National Assembly and have seats in the National Assembly, the French presidency, indeed the European Parliament, because if you're French, you're part of Europe. Now, that's bizarre, and most Kanak don't vote. In fact, many New Caledonians of all ethnicities don't bother to vote for the European Parliament, because quite rightly they see it as a legislature on the other side of the world that's got not much to do with them. And it's actually quite significant because Europe puts a lot of money into the Pacific. But that notion that, and always talked about the mission civilisatrice, France is to civilize the savages. But that continues to this day. And when you listen to French politicians like Emmanuel Macron or the succession of overseas ministers that he's had in recent years, they all talk about French Republican values and see any challenge to those Republican values as a threat to French rights. So there's this clash between local perspectives and what the French ideology of universalism brings about. The fundamental problem is New Caledonia in 1986 and French Polynesia in 2013 were both recognised by the United Nations as non-self-governing territories, to use the UN jargon. Under international law, the United Nations recognises these French dependencies as colonies, as non-self-governing territories. The UN Special Committee on Decolonisation, which was formed in the 1960s, still exists. Hasn't got many colonies left in the world, but they're there. And so countries like Papua New Guinea and Fiji, neighbouring independent states in the Pacific, are members of the C24, the Decolonisation Committee. And under international law, they say France still has responsibilities for decolonisation. France still has obligations as an administering power a quarter of the way through the 21st century. And that tension between these French values that this is the Republic, the united, indivisible Republic, versus international law. And that tension's played out because France gets very angry when neighbouring countries as they say, interfere in the internal affairs of France.
Mm.
Well, sorry, international law says, no, you're a colonial power, you're an administering power, and you have obligations to lead New Caledonia towards a new political status.
So then, naturally enough, this like sovereignty aspect is huge, and like it's these kind of sops to kind of autonomy and independence that, like, healthcare must be like, sure, you get to administrate health, but if you don't have control of a lot of economic levers, it's hard to properly utilize health. Like, health strategy in a lot of countries and territories can be determined by local taxation. Like, I need to raise money because of some sort of crisis. New Caledonia is in a completely different climate to metropolitan France. They're probably dealing with completely different issues.
Yeah, we saw this similarly too with like Mayotte and the
Reunion had like a dengue fever outbreak as an example.
Yeah.
I remember that. And that's something that doesn't happen in like Toulouse. So yeah, this is interesting. I guess this kind of leads us more to very, very present day issues, and moving into the modern age, kind of like the first time I kind of hear about New Caledonia as someone who pays attention to just like European news, is the referendums regarding independence. And even someone who like has no understanding of New Caledonia, I'm very aware of like just throwing out a referendum is probably not going to address the issue. Like, I knew nothing about New Caledonia. I knew there was definitely going to be like probably at the bare minimum an ethnic divide between indigenous Caledonians and like white French people who have probably settled there over the years. I had no understanding of the demographics, but I did see the result of the referendum, and then I did see like forces of French government kind of like waving that around, being like, look, they love us, they're going to stay. And I think that was like the first referendum. A second, it was also in the middle of the pandemic, I believe it happened as well. Was that like in 2020?
There were three referendums at the end of the Namur Accord process. So, as I say, the Namur Accord signed in 1998. Over more than 20 years, this transition with powers being passed from Paris to New Caledonia. And all of this was entrenched in the French Constitution. It's quite unique. French Polynesia, Mayotte, Guadeloupe don't have the same rights. And New Caledonian citizens, there's a restricted electorate where only long-term residents, quite complex technically, but long-term residents can vote for the local institutions. The end of that process, or the next step in that process, was these referendums on independence. Quite uniquely, they said that there could be not one but up to three referendums at the end of this transition. And if the first one was no, then you could have a second one. If the second vote was no, you could have a third. The French and the local loyalists, the local conservative anti-independence parties, were expecting they'd beat the independence movement like a gong. I was there as a journalist reporting during the 2018 referendum, and the expectation was the independence movement, their dream was over, they'd get 25-30% of the vote. They got 43%. Obviously not a majority, but it scared the hell out of everyone, the French High Commission especially. They then went to the second vote in 2 years later in 2020. Once again, the independence movement didn't win, but they increased their vote to 47, nearly 48%. Once again, that freaked out people in Paris who thought that they had this under control. Rather than wait for 2 years, the 2-year sequencing for the referendum, the French government, at the time, Overseas Minister Sébastien Lecornu, who's today France's Armed Forces Minister, decided to rush through the vote in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and held it in December 2021. That vote has been contested ever since, mainly because all supporters of independence just stayed away from the polls. Turnout halved compared to the previous votes. The result was not 43, 47% in favour of independence, but 3%. Basically, people just didn't vote. The French claim it's a valid referendum. That's nonsense. Whatever legalities there may be in French law that this was held, politically, it's not worked. And everyone in the Pacific knows that. Most people in France don't understand that. And as you say, the French government and the loyalist parties say, we won. There were 3 referendums. You had your chance. You lost. And the independence movement has never accepted that. Then when France tried to change voting rights in late 23, 24, early 24, things moved towards a crisis. And partly that's because, as you suggested, this is not just a political question. It's an economic, it's a social, it's a cultural question. New Caledonia is an incredibly divided society. It's very rich by Pacific standards. You know, it's got a higher GDP per capita than New Zealand. It's, you know, got a lot of money pouring in from France, but it's what we Australians call boomerang aid. You throw it out and it comes back to you. A lot of the money France puts into New Caledonia and French Polynesia every year comes back by paying French public servants, by pensions for former public servants, the military and the like. And there are many ordinary people, not just Kanak, but also Wallisian from Vanuatu, they're called Petit Blanc, you know, sort of poor white people who don't have access to the benefits of this largesse. And, you know, there are thousands of people living in squatter settlements around Noumea, the capital. And so when Macron tried to ram things through in the middle of last year, on the 13th of May, the very day that these constitutional changes on voting rights went to the French National Assembly, rioting broke out in New Caledonia. Young people stormed out of the squatter settlements. They burnt down on the first night a big factory owned by one of the leading anti-independence families. They burnt the Renault and the Porsche dealership. The very fact that there's a Porsche dealership in Noumea in the South Pacific gives you an idea of this disparity of wealth. And the French unleashed the security forces on these rioters, and the youth did not back down. And so for 5 or 6 months, there were clashes between Kanak protesters and some 6,000 gendarmes, GIGN elite paramilitary forces, CRS riot squads, an anti-terrorist squad, all backed by French military forces, transported from France, from Tahiti, to crack down. And the militarization of the conflict led to an incredible diplomatic backlash in the region. The tragedy is 14 people died, hundreds were injured, 2,600 arrested, including a number of key Kanak leaders who were deported to France and are currently held in prisons across France in pre-trial detention. To this day, the economy collapsed. And it's you know, for working people, for working class people, whatever their ethnicity, it's really tough at the moment. And literally thousands of French nationals who've been living there very comfortably have left. So the stakes are pretty high. And Macron and Lecornu, Gérald Darmanin, France's hardline interior minister at the time, have tried to blame Azerbaijan, have tried to blame Australia, have tried to blame everyone except their own policy failures. And, you know, the largest independence party, Union Calédonienne, and other smaller parties in the FLNKS have not backed down. They say we still want a pathway to independence. And this is the current situation where there are talks about the way forward between the French state, supporters and opponents of independence, but the rioting, the clashes between Kanak protesters, French police, French riot squads, have shown that the Kanak people are not going to give up. And most of the protesters were young people.
Further questions about the Azerbaijan thing later, because that is a weird kind of node of interest simply just for our listeners. But I remember with then covering the like riots in New Caledonia that then And I don't know if this is just simply because it's a far away, distant, French holding, part of like the French, colonial sphere, not even a sphere of influence, part of France. It was incredibly difficult to get information out of the country. It felt like is how then, just simply out of curiosity, just from my end, of when this stuff happens, is it simply just because of like the distance of what Ciarán mentioned, of that getting information out of France is quite difficult, or does France really try to like kind of keep a media stranglehold over what happens in New Caledonia to kind of like, perceive that either these riots and the general distaste from a general portion, from what it seems like half of the population who does vote pro-independence, or is this, or is it simply just like a natural course of events that then like New Caledonia being so far away is kind of out of sight, out of mind? There isn't, because it does seem that there is like a control of information that France maintains over the island from at least like our perspectives here.
There's a certain invisibility about it, and that's true in Australia and in New Zealand, in America, not just in France. People are constantly shocked when you say France is a colonial power. We're a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and France is still administering colonies. Now, most French diplomats don't like it when you use the C word. When you use the C word, you're supposed to be talking about China, not colonialism. Because China obviously is the big issue in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's at one level. Most French citizens are, dealing with Macron's austerity policies at home. There's been massive struggles in France around the Gilets jaunes movement, around trade unionists protecting their rights on pensions and so on. A whole range of things. We don't have time to go into it today, but you'll know, of course, that, Macron does not have a governing majority in the National Assembly since he failed in the 2022 European Parliament elections, held snap elections as a gamble, and came out with the left-wing alliance and the Rassemblement National holding significant seats in the National Assembly. He's a lame duck. He's only got till 2027. And people in New Caledonia are looking at this chaos in the French parliamentary system when they need economic support to rebuild after the riots. And, the Barnier government lasted 3 months. François Bayrou, the current Prime Minister, may run into trouble in July with a no-confidence motion. It's the other side of the world. And for that reason, it's not there. There was a flurry of media interest in the middle of the year because there was what I call bang bang, a flurry of journalists. I've been going to New Caledonia for decades and reporting on it for a magazine in Fiji because it's part of the Pacific. And, New Caledonia, we're trying to transcend the colonial boundaries created from the 19th century. So we work alongside, other Pacific peoples. And the monthly magazine I write for, covers this in great depth. But it was only when there were barricades and flags flying and police firing tear gas and so on that it became sexy. And so the flurry of French media arriving from Australia, NHK from Japan, New York Times, and that lasted about 3 months while there was a lot of bang bang. And it's all gone again. I was there in October last year and, had the job to myself once again to report on this because it's very expensive to travel in our part of the world across the Pacific. It's a huge area. Local media is also constrained. For a long time, the one daily newspaper, Le Nouveau Calédonien, was run by a consortium of local businessmen. Then the Elson Group, some called him the Rupert Murdoch of France, local businessmen. Then they ran it into the ground 18 months ago, and so the daily newspaper isn't there. Of course, the French public broadcasters are part of the French state, and so they're constrained to a certain extent in their editorial policy on what can be said. And the independence movement feel, and I think quite rightly, that their views and perspectives are either ignored or covered up. And that was very clear last year. And I personally, as a journalist who knows something about the place and speaks French and goes there regularly, was denounced by the French High Commission for fake news because I talked about the militarisation of the conflict last year, that France, rather than trying to negotiate their way through the situation, brought literally thousands of gendarmes, of riot squads and so on. And the bitterness of that time is still there. It hasn't solved the problems, and the current Overseas Minister, Manuel Valls, has come twice to New Caledonia this year, 2025, to try and bring people back around the table. There are currently negotiations on what happens next between the French state, supporters and opponents of independence. But all of this is happening. New Caledonia is pretty invisible when you think about what's happening in the world. The election of Donald Trump has transformed what people talk about the Indo-Pacific region. France, obviously, as part of the European Union, is involved in big debates about what happens next, from everything to arms manufacture to political unity and so on. So it's hardly surprising that the concerns of 260,000 people on the other side of the world don't rate very highly in the media. And that's why, frankly, every now and then the FLNKS has turned to protest simply because they've got to get their perspective across.
I do like your description of the bang bang, because like the images I saw from all the news was like fire being set to the most sacred of French institutions in New Caledonia, which is the Renault dealership. That was like the only thing they seem to care about.
Well, these are, as I say, there are economic drivers, there are social drivers, there's poverty. And look, in many Pacific countries, in Fiji, in Papua New Guinea, in Tonga, there have been riots that are based around class issues as well as issues of ethnicity. And it's hardly surprising when you look at the world, the enormous inequality. Pacific Island societies are just like any society. There are those who are doing very nicely, thank you, and those who are living in squatter settlements. And that enormous gap is there. Particularly, too, there are battles over resources. One of the reasons that France is concerned about maintaining its administration of non-self-governing territories in the Pacific is because they have an awful lot of ocean. All of France's overseas, under the International Convention on the Law of the Sea, you can have a 200 nautical mile zone around every piece of land, every reef, called the exclusive economic zone. And you can manage and control the resources within that zone. In the Pacific, France has 7 million square kilometres of EEZ, 500,000 around French Polynesia, 1.3 million square kilometres around there. And so when it comes to things like deep sea oil and gas, seabed minerals, marine biodiversity, that's an enormous resource, combined, of course, with New Caledonia's nickel, which is an incredibly important strategic metal used from everything from pots and pans to rocket ships and armaments. Also electric car batteries. Nickel matte is very useful for EVs and things. So there's a lot to fight over in terms of resources and resource extractivism.
Yeah, I think
just saying the nickel's very important because, like, I think the other big source of that is Russia, which we've like cut ourselves off from, basically. So, yeah.
Well, the other thing is that in recent decades, the New Caledonia government and companies who've been working with transnational corporations to not only mine nickel ore but develop nickel smelting, the value add to the resource. The biggest markets for New Caledonia nickel are in the Asia-Pacific region. It's China, South Korea, Japan. There are some new contracts with Australia. But Macron wants these resources for France and Europe. He came in July 2023, gave a speech in the Place de Cocotier and said just that.
Yeah. Quick thing of just, I think everyone forgets that France has the largest exclusive economic zone in the entire world. And that's always a bizarre fact that I always think of it is some country like the United States or Russia, but no, because of all these holdings everywhere in the world, and how many millions of nautical miles was that you said that they had alone in the Pacific?
7 million square kilometers in the Pacific, 11 million overall.
Square kilometers, yeah. That's insane.
There was a French Senate report, it must be about a decade ago, and there's a wonderful quote. They said, "Present in both hemispheres and at all points of the compass, the French exclusive economic zone is the only one on which the sun never sets." And that's
that old adage.
Yeah,
that's the sort of language that the Brits used to use. The British Empire,
exactly.
is, all around the world, and this is the sort of attitude. Now, today there's a huge debate about deep sea mining in the Pacific. Some smaller states are looking to exploiting the nickel nodules, the rare earths, the undersea vents, and so on, for new mineral sources. And there's a hot debate. A lot of people are fiercely opposed to it because of environmental concerns. And they worried. Last year at the Pacific Islands Forum, I interviewed the president of French Polynesia, and he said, the Moana Nui Ahiva, the ocean, is the cradle of life, and we don't want to be guinea pigs with deep-sea mining. We've been guinea pigs for the nuclear tests. We don't want to be guinea pigs for the deep-sea mining if it goes full scale before the technology is ready. France let off 193 nuclear weapons at Moruroa and Whangatofa Atoll over 30 years in the 20th century, and people are living with the radioactive consequences of that. French Polynesia has the highest rate of thyroid cancer and one of the highest rates in the world. People are now looking at French policies about the oceans, about exploiting deep-sea resources and so on, and saying, we're a laboratory in the 21st century, just like we were in the 20th century for nuclear testing. And we're going to live with the consequences of that, and people are going to take the resources and walk away. And so what's happening in New Caledonia about the local drivers are also regional drivers about, how small island states survive in an era of geopolitical contest. And obviously the United States, China, Australia are the big players, but times are changing.
I think that's a perfect transition as well to kind of maybe the next part of the discussion that we wanted to have, which is not only how the sentiments internally within New Caledonia are towards, the main, I don't want to say mainland France. That sounds weird, but to the, the governing core, administration, the imperial core, as you will, of France, but also, and I think that you're kind of getting to the point here with how France views New Caledonia, not only just in the sense of its, resource, its resource, riches that it has in terms of nickel, in terms of deep sea mining, et cetera, but also then the position that it puts France into kind of the new, possibly post-U.S. century or decade, whatever you want to call it. We jokingly call it we're in the Chinese century, but the French decade of the Chinese century currently. How does then, particularly New Caledonia and these Pacific holdings serve France geopolitically as well in terms of their defense? Ciarán wants to believe that Gaullism is alive and well. I think he may be right, but how do these Pacific holdings, how does France justify these political holdings in their new attitudes towards, say, China and the South Pacific?
Going back to the days when President Jacques Chirac was in power some decades ago, Chirac famously said that New Caledonia was an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific. France has small military bases and a few frigates, patrol boats, some surveillance aircraft and helicopters in the region, but no significant firepower. The frigates are aging, built in the 20th century, and so on. But Macron, particularly since his election in 2017, has been eager to expand France's role in the Indo-Pacific region, as it's dubbed. We used to call it the Asia-Pacific, but the new jargon is Indo-Pacific, trying to look at the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean as one block. The US Pacific Command, based in Hawaii, changed its name to Indo-Pacific Command. And Macron came to the Pacific in 2018 on his first visit as president, stopped off in Sydney and gave a speech, went to Noumea, New Caledonia, capital, and he talked about creating an India-Australia-France axis. And New Caledonia would be the pivot for that axis, in this Indo-Pacific region. Since then, he's talked about France as a stabilizing or balancing force at a time of incredible US-China strategic competition in the region, where China is a major economic and military power, very active in the Pacific Islands in a way that the Russians never were in the 20th century. And so Macron sort of presents France as an independent, stable, democratic power. It started to build relationships with India and Australia. And, although they wouldn't say it, it was directed against China. However, the contradictions between France and, to a certain extent, other European powers in the United States were playing out at that time. So one of the drivers of French policy in the Indo-Pacific is, frankly, selling weapons. France's merchant of death is a central part of this discussion. Macron has been very eager to expand sales of Rafale jet fighters to India. They've sold armaments to Indonesia and other ASEAN countries, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And the centerpiece of this was a proposed $90 billion contract for the Australian Defence Force to buy submarines from France. Now, that came a cropper in September 2021 when Britain, the United States, and Australia signed the AUKUS agreement, Australia, United Kingdom, United States. And Australia now plans to build nuclear submarines with the Americans and the Brits. It's never going to happen. It's a farce, but nonetheless, that's another topic. It was a huge blow to French pretensions, though, and the Americans recognised that France talked tough about being a significant Indo-Pacific player, but the military forces deployed in the region were not that strong. And, France uses this vast expanse of the Pacific as almost like an arms showcase. When he came, I was the only foreign journalist to report on Macron's visit in July 2023 to New Caledonia. And he arrived, his presidential jet arrived, having flown halfway around the world, accompanied by 2 Rafale jet fighters, these high-tech military jet fighters. And he tweeted, you can go and look it up on his X, a picture of the presidential jet coming down to land in the sunset of the Pacific with these 2 jet fighters accompanying the flight. And he tweeted it out and said, this shows that France can operate in these great planes we've got. And, he got 2 million hits on his tweet, which is more than I get. And, there's a whole lot of allegations of corruption about, the sale of Rafale to India, and it's a scandal, the submarine mess here. France is very interested in expanding its arms sales, and we've seen this just in recent times related to Ukraine because of the Trump administration. Just 2 weeks ago, Macron, speaking in the newspapers in France, said, we must offer European alternatives to countries accustomed to American equipment. So he's urging countries like Poland and Finland to replace Lockheed Martin F-35 fighters made by the Americans with these Rafale fighters built by Dassault Aviation. There's a missile system developed by Eurosam, which is a joint venture between Thales, French corporation, and an Italian arms corporation. And, one of Ukraine and others buy that instead of Patriots from the Americans. So in the current conjuncture where, what's the madness of the Trump administration is polarizing these issues. And frankly, there's a significant debate about whether France and Europe will militarize in ways through massive arms spending. Now, for us on the other side of the world, we look at this with horror because the nuclear saber rattling that's going on at the moment, the weapons for France, for Britain, for the United States were tested in the South Pacific. For 50 years, the three Western powers tested their weapons in their colonies in the Pacific. The British, Australia wasn't a colony, but the British let off nuclear weapons in the deserts of Australia at Maralinga, at Emu Field on Aboriginal land. The Americans tested 67 atomic and hydrogen bombs in the Marshall Islands. The French 193 nuclear tests underground and in the atmosphere at Moruroa, Fangatofa atolls in their colony, French Polynesia. So when we see this, and that's why most Pacific Island countries have signed and ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, have created a nuclear-free zone, nuclear weapons-free zone in the South Pacific. People don't want any part of this. And yet there's enormous pressure to choose sides in the US-China strategic competition. France says, we are your buddies, we are your climate buddies, we are your allies, we want to work with you as an alternative to these military powers. But people look at France as a colonial power. And that's the real importance of what happened with the riots and clashes in 2024. France had improved its reputation in the South Pacific since it's ended nuclear testing in 1996, since it started this transition in New Caledonia towards greater autonomy and possibly independence in New Caledonia. But for 6 months, the image of French gendarmes, riot squads, GIN police bashing the hell out of young Kanak protesters, the sympathy for France in neighbouring countries was very badly damaged, and they know it. What happens next, we'll see, because, there's a lot of moving parts in the world, and many Pacific countries are concerned that as Europe militarizes related to Russia, to Ukraine, to what's happening, as Trump goes berserk and pulls out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, the core priorities of Pacific Island countries around development, around the oceans, and particularly about their greatest security threat, which is climate change, are going to be forgotten. There's a long way to go.
It's pretty even at its current state, it's pretty speaking out two sides to your mouth, because, Macron's coming along, I guess, going with a strategy of better the devil is I guess kind of the sales pitch here, which is a very weak one to begin with. But even just being we're your climate buddies anyway, let's blow up the ocean and then mine the crater, seems to be the strategy for what they're going to do in the Pacific. Because I love predicting the future, because why not? Let's have some fun here. Let's make some swings. Let's call some shots. But I kind of see France retreating almost into Europe, kind of sheltering in there. But that just kind of means that the brutality increases in the far-flung regions, because it now just gets purely reduced to resource extraction. There's no way France is going to willingly give up this huge economic zone, these strategic resources.
I mean, I simply, to interject to your question first, I guess, Ciarán, just as an observation, maybe there's a thing that we can look towards. Remember France's formation of what is it, ECOWAS, the West African economic system that then is crumbling before its own eyes at the moment. France has been very bad about when it removes itself as an actual arbiter of pure colonialism and tries to do the more US centric of you want to be our buddies, right? There's the only game in town, especially in the sense of the military activity in Mali, where they couldn't take down an insurgency of a couple thousand people with one of the most militarily advanced armies in the world, and somehow Russia and Wagner was able to do it. France doesn't actually like flexing power in this American way. You know, I feel that then in the sense of like France, if you're saying to the sense of then France is like retreating into Europe and then kind of making that then their main concern. Well, we've kind of seen what happens in recent years with at least, you know, West Africa. France is quite bad at this. And France has just literally kind of given up as of late with now, if I'm not mistaken, is it Niger and Burkina Faso that have just kind of like removed themselves entirely from it. And France has kind of just like, you know, thrown their hand in and been like, fine, you know. And also China in Africa too has been very much, I mean, not even just for France, but for every European country, you know, a lot of the times they would rather work with China, even though, yes, they're aware of in the sense of, you know, the possible pitfalls that exist. China's more attractive at the end of the day for most of them.
This is the reality. This is the reality in the Pacific, that China is a major economic power and has diplomatic and trading relations across the region. China is New Caledonia's largest market for nickel ore, not France. China is indeed the largest trading partner for Australia, for New Zealand, for Papua New Guinea. You know, China is a significant player in this part of the world. And, you know, Australia and the Anglosphere are grappling with this just like France is. As you say, though, when you look at what happened with Operation Barkhane in North Africa, in the Sahel and so on, France was beaten like a gong, essentially, and has been withdrawn. In recent months, we've seen many former colonies in Africa saying no. And there are not to the same level of crisis as in New Caledonia, but in Mayotte, for example, there was a major cyclone. And a lot of criticism from ordinary people in Mayotte that, you know, Paris wasn't paying attention to their immediate needs. That's certainly the feeling when I was last in New Caledonia, talking with politicians across the political spectrum, including key loyalist, anti-independence politicians who want to maintain their status within the French Republic. They're very concerned that Paris has dropped the ball. You know, the very fact the Barnier government, which was trying to get a budget through, only lasted 3 months and then collapsed in a heap for New Caledonians. And many business people can't get reinsured because the French insurance companies won't insure them for riot anymore. You know, these sort of the daily life of ordinary people is a struggle everywhere in the world. But when it's people in Paris making decisions, financial decisions, political decisions, military decisions, it's only natural that whether you're pro-independence or just want to stay somehow connected to France, you look with despair at what's happening. And people can count. There are 2 years until the next presidential elections in France.
Yep.
The situation with possibly Edouard Philippe representing the Liberal right, Marine Le Pen, obviously, a leading candidate for the presidency. People are wondering, if you make a deal now on New Caledonia's political status, who's going to be implementing that deal in 2 years' time? So there's, although there are talks underway as we speak about New Caledonia's political future with people in France, you know, you do a deal with the overseas minister today, he may be gone in a couple of months. And so people are watching this. Everyone's holding their breath to see what happens between the United States and Europe. And, you know, when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. And people in the Pacific recognize that they are small micro-states, a long way from the hubs of capitalist accumulation, but they're strategically significant, and they're stuck in that drive. I think what's heartening, though, and I want to stress on a positive note, Pacific Islanders are not sitting there saying, oh, woe is us, we're victims and things like that. The young people, you know, climate activists have a slogan, we're not drowning, we're fighting, is their slogan. You know, Vanuatu last year, supported by other countries, led a campaign to get an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change and human rights. You know, Vanuatu is a tiny country, former British-French colony. It's only a few 100,000 people, yet they mobilized a global coalition to call on the highest international court to start setting new norms about the human rights implications of climate change. the Marshall Islands, one of the smallest former American territories, for the first time is on the UN Human Rights Council fighting. So small island states have been using the existing multilateral system to advance their agenda around oceans, ocean protection, around climate action, climate finance, around culture and development and so on. And they look with horror at the attack on multilateralism at the moment that's coming in all directions, and, exemplified by the genocide in Gaza, which has horrified ordinary people, even though Pacific governments tend to back the US position. This is a time of incredible change. And I think the headlines that focus on Europe, America, China, forget there's an awful lot of other countries in the world. And the invisibility in the media of those people has both strengths and weaknesses. People say, well, we've got to forge our own way ahead. Not going to be easy. But the South Pacific did this in the mid-90s when they created a nuclear weapons-free zone. They can do it again. And I think, in our part of the world, there are significant changes underway. It's not neat. The Pacific countries are weak economically, politically, military, but they don't want to choose sides in a fight that has no winners.
It is kind of like one of the criticisms. Some people kind of talked about this like multipolar world emerging and kind of like looked upon that somewhat favorably because it was possibly more appealing than just America controlling everything. But then for a lot of countries in the South Pacific, Africa is probably very similar, of just like, well, the choice between two poles of the world that don't give a shit about you versus the choice between 5 poles of the world that don't give a shit about you is not a super appealing change.
But this is the importance of what we're talking about, the 19th century colonialism. This has happened before in the Pacific.
Yeah.
Where, Britain, France, Portugal and others came to carve up the islands, just as they did in Africa and Asia.
Mm-hmm.
The Second World War, people have lived through periods of the US-Japan War, which caused enormous damage across the region. They've lived through 50 years of nuclear testing. There's a resilience and creativity that should not be underestimated. And what's striking is at the moment that, France's colonial policy seems such an anachronism. And the language coming from Paris and from Washington and, dare I say, Canberra about the rules-based order has been, human rights and so on against the authoritarian regimes like Russia and China has been really badly damaged by Gaza and by the crisis in New Caledonia last year. And what's striking is that we focus on the big countries, US, China, and so on. There are lots of players, lots of niche players now in the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Islands Forum, the main regional body, has, a couple of dozen what they call dialogue partners. Some of them are big powers, some of them are small. And Pacific Islands are willing to work with all sorts of people that maybe years ago they wouldn't have. I'll give you one example. Cuba, for example, is training hundreds of Pacific Islanders as medical officers. From people from Kiribati and Solomon Islands and Fiji, and all these countries have gone off to Havana to do training, and the Cubans have a reputation for preventative and primary health training. Now, can I say Australia, America haven't trained that many doctors in recent years. Most Pacific Islanders are conservative and Christian, but they're willing to work with a country like Cuba, a fellow small island state, because the Cubans are willing to work with them on issues around health.
Yep.
So Pacific Islanders are pretty pragmatic. They don't like the Chinese Communist Party, many of them, but they're willing to work with China because it's a major economic power that provides funding for infrastructure, that provides trade opportunities, training, and all the rest. People aren't naive about jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, moving away from France, Britain, United States, and Australia, the former colonial powers, to go to bed with the Chinese. But everyone in the world is grappling with this. And I think what's sometimes missed in media coverage of the Pacific Islands, these are not Pacific problems. people in the Pacific are grappling with what are global problems. Everyone in the world, big or small, is grappling with the rise of China as a significant economic and military player in the 21st century. Everyone is grappling with the question of how do you deal with transnational corporations who want to plunder natural resources and leave behind the waste. Everyone in the world is grappling with the challenge of violence against women in the home, in the workplace, in the community. And everyone's grappling with the greatest security challenge that faces our planet, the converging issues of nuclear threat and climate change. And Pacific Islanders have shown in the past, as I say, with the creation of the South Pacific Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone, we don't want to be part of the nuclearization that we saw during the Reagan-Gorbachev era. They're signing the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons now, a nuclear abolition treaty, saying Russia, America, China can rattle their nuclear sabers. We don't want any part of it. Now, it's really hard to do when you're a small, weak country, but that spirit is pretty clear. And that fight is what's being played out at the moment. And I think, the image that people have of the Pacific Islands as poor, weak microstates, yeah, but that gives them a level of flexibility and creativity to move in the world. And that's really important in what's talked about, this new multipolar world. There's a lot of players, hard to deal with, many of them, but it's the world's changing, and the Pacific peoples are changing. New Caledonians are grappling with this just like the rest of us.
Nic, all that's left to say at this point is thank you so much for coming on. This has been an incredible conversation, to say the least. My God. Where can people find you and your writing?
So I'm a correspondent with a magazine that's published in Fiji called Islands Business. We are a news and current affairs magazine run by Fijians. I'm been a long-time correspondent for them. And islandsbusiness.com, the website. If you Google my name, and there you'll find writings on all these topics by Pacific Islanders. I also write for an Australian website called Inside Story, which is covers a whole range of issues from an Australian perspective, and I'm their Pacific correspondent. So once again, I've written extensively about New Caledonia, French Polynesia, French colonialism in the region, and of course other wider issues for the Pacific Islands. So that's Inside Story. It's an Australian website, and if you Google that, you'll come across quite a lot of coverage of these sorts of issues from the other end of the world, from Europe. We're all grappling with the European heritage. My mob came from Scotland during the gold rushes, and we're living on stolen Aboriginal land in Australia. These questions about Indigenous rights, about sovereignty, about the legacies of past and present colonialism are part of the everyday conversations in the South Pacific. And people watch the world coming to them. We're also trying to act rather than just sit back. And I think that's the sort of spirit you'll find when you dig into these sort of stories that are coming out from a whole younger generation of Pacific Islanders who want to forge their own path at a time when the world's in change.
We will have links to all of Nic's work and where to find him online in the description. Please do check out his work. Thanks again for coming on, and we will catch you, the listener, on the bonus feed. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.